Good morning. All right. My name is Ted Harrington. I'm, as Jim mentioned, executive partner at Independent Security Evaluators, and we're most commonly known as being the first company to hack the iPhone. So what I'm here to talk about today is to have a bit of an analysis about hackers, how they operate, and we're going to have some fun looking into some attacks and how those attacks actually work. We all read in the newspaper about XYZ company was hacked. Well, what does that mean? How'd the hackers do it? And then what we're going to walk away with is a range of lessons and key takeaways that we can all have as a community of technologists about how to improve. You know, the point is not to just talk about doom and gloom. It is scary out there, but there are things that we can do that will make systems more resilient against these very sophisticated attackers. So the question I always ask myself before I get on stage, and this is a question that anytime you're an audience of any talk, you should be asking of the speakers, why is this important? Why am I taking time out of my day to cover this topic? And this is important because the attackers are becoming much more sophisticated. The attacks, the vectors themselves are much more evolved. Digital assets are becoming much more valuable, and the traditional defense measures that are in place are no longer robust enough. But there is an upside, which is that there are things that we can do to actually defend against these sophisticated attacks that, as we'll discuss a little bit, are not actually going to be tremendously more expensive. As a matter of fact, many of them are less expensive. So what I'll do is I'll talk about a range of high-profile attacks, some of them from our research practice, some of them from our consulting practice, and some of them stripped from headline news. And we'll talk about how those attacks worked. And then with each attack, I'll overlay a key takeaway and what we can do in development practices to defend accordingly. So the first one we'll start with is Texas Instruments. Our company was founded in 2005 out of the PhD program at Johns Hopkins. And specifically, we were born out of a lab to study RFID systems. And this was, as I said, in 2005, so if we can rewind back about 9 years, Texas Instruments had this system, the DST-40, that was considered at the time unbreakable. Well, you say unbreakable to a bunch of hacker-minded computer scientists, and they're going to say, challenge accepted. So what we did was we set out to design a study to look at this unbreakable system, and the idea was, well, if we're successful in this, there will probably be commercial interest, so let's put together a company. And so on paper, ISE was born by a bunch of computer scientists in a lab. The reason that we were compelled to look at this particular system was not just because it was considered unbreakable, but because it powered two very important systems, and today still powers those systems. One is the immobilizer function of Ford vehicles. So who here rented a car and drove here today or owns a Ford? Okay, Ford wouldn't be psyched about that market penetration. Okay, so all cars have this same function, but the idea is it's a communication protocol between the key and the computer within the car itself that says, first there's a physical turnover of the ignition, but then this communication protocol says, is this the authentic key? Can this key actually start the vehicle? And it's to prevent things like you drop your car off at the valet goes to Lowe's while you're at dinner, copies your car, and then comes and steals it later with no breaking and entering. So there's obvious security implications with that use case. And the other was the ExxonMobil Speed Pass. So the ExxonMobil Speed Pass is a RFID token that goes on your keychain, and it connects to your credit card, and it allows you to not have to pull out your credit card when you're going to pump gas or buy Funyuns when you go inside the market. And so what we did was we set out to study this system, and the process was about 2 weeks of research. About 2 weeks after that, we had reverse engineered the cryptographic algorithm in pairs of bits. A couple weeks after that, we had a non-functioning prototype, and a couple weeks after that, there we were proving concept by starting a Ford car with a reverse engineered key. And I actually have a video of that moment to share with you.
So this is the actual key to the car. It has a DSC tag inside of it. So we can start the car with that. See if it works.
Now we're not going to use the key anymore.
So this is a copy of the key we made at Lowe's. $1.49 is just a metal copy. See, it does nothing. Won't start the car. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use our software radio, and this is the antenna which is connected to the software radio, which is in the back. Hold it up while we turn the key. Go.
And thus ISE was born. My favorite part about that video is at the end, the guy in the passenger seat, that's my business partner, Steve, and just the shit-eating grin on his face when he says, yeah, we just did that. So my slides seem to have... Okay. And so that was the birth of our company, and here we are today where we've grown into basically two main units. About 20% of our work is research similar to Texas Instruments, where we actually look at systems that were not paid or contracted in any way to look at, and we just research the security implications about them and publish the results. Last year, I'll talk about this later in the talk today, but last year we came out with a study that found nothing short of an epidemic in small office, home office routers. And our next study, our big effort, is going to be looking at hospitals and understanding how to secure a hospital ecosystem. Okay, so the next attack we can talk about is one that I don't think anyone in here has heard of. It's a small company called Target. And so, show of hands, who has shopped at Target since November? It's okay, I have. Okay, so obviously we're all familiar with the headline news they've been making. And so the attack looked something like this. Using a spear phishing campaign, the attackers attacked a vendor of Target's. It was an HVAC vendor, and they were able to obtain the vendor's credentials. With the vendor's credentials, the attackers were now able to remotely access Target's network environment. The reason this HVAC vendor had these remote credentials is because they had to do certain operational functions to monitor usage, temperature, things like that. So when the store is closed, they make sure that it doesn't get too hot or too cold that would spoil produce or make it uncomfortable for customers to come in the door once the doors are supposed to open. Obviously, if customers aren't in the door, you're not making money. And so that's why they had this remote access, as they should have. However, they should not have been able to get from the maintenance environment over to the payment environment. And the attackers took advantage of improper network segmentation to jump over to the payment environment. They installed a malware known as a RAM scraper. And what a RAM scraper basically does is it just looks for a certain string of digits, either 15 or 16 digits, that would be similar to what credit card numbers look like. And for anyone who is familiar with PCI standards, you know that credit cards are encrypted nearly all of the time. But there is a millisecond when they're decrypted to perform the transaction. And the RAM scraper at that moment basically just copied that number into a file. The transaction performed as intended. No one knew anything had happened. So that's how the attack worked, in that now they have the credit card numbers, but they're sitting on Target servers. So what the attackers did that was very sophisticated was the exfiltration method. They didn't, a typical attack would have come and stolen that server to then figure out how to get the file off of it. Can't really quite do that to a company of Target's scale. So what they were actually able to do was taking advantage of a communication protocol known as NetBIOS that allows systems that don't communicate with each other to communicate with each other. And so with legitimate traffic, mixed in with legitimate traffic, these files of stolen credit cards were moved around network Target's environment to a point where they could move outside of the environment without setting off any particular alarms, and distributed to compromised servers around the world, and then the attackers were able to go get those files without ever entering Target's environment. And that's how they stole 40 million credit cards. So what's the key takeaway here? What can we do to prevent something like this? The key lesson here is to secure assets and not just perimeters. So traditional defense methodology has focused around what a traditional attack looks like. And traditional attacks focus on basically three key areas. You attack your people, you attack via a remote attack, via the internet or some other connected angle, or you attack the physical facility. And so in order to defend against those, you train your people, you put up firewalls and build a nice, firm, secure perimeter, and then you put security guards and other anti-intrusion measures at the physical location. That's not the way modern attacks work. I mean, there are attackers who still attack in those vectors, but the way modern attacks work is all of the embedded systems, all of the integrated vendors that all systems are using are now the vectors. So this method of a stepping stone attack, like you saw at Target, where a vendor was attacked, but the payload was deployed at Target. And that is a key difference in how to defend against this type of attack. And so how do we do that? Well, what we do is we build layers of defense in depth. So it starts with changing a mindset. So rather than thinking, I'm going to do everything I can to keep the bad guy out and he's going to stay out, it's, let me assume the bad guy is already in today. And if the bad guy is in today, right now, as we're sitting in this room, if there's a bad guy in your system, where are your assets? Does the bad guy have access to everything? Does he have carte blanche? Well, if he does, that's a problem. So one of the things we'll do is we'll start with the highest value asset, build defenses around that, and work outwards. The next hack that we'll talk about, I actually can't really disclose any of the specific attack details on this one, but I want to talk about the lessons that come out of it. This comes out of our consulting practice, and due to non-disclosure agreements, I can't actually disclose the specifics. But effectively, we had a customer who is a chipset manufacturer, a major chipset manufacturer, and they came to us asking us to look at their newest secure chipset. And they wanted to make sure that once it gets deployed and starts going out to consumers, that it can't be easily hacked. And so they came to us and they said, we want a black box penetration test. And we said, well, what do you really want? And they said, oh, well, what we want is we want to understand what is our resilience against an outside attacker and how will they be able to get our assets, or will they be able to get our assets? We said, okay, what in fact you'd want is not a black box penetration test. What you just asked for was a white box vulnerability assessment. And this is an interesting discussion because there has become over time a bit of an ambiguity about what the various terms mean. And there's become this trend preference to ask for black box penetration tests. So just show of hands here. Who has been part of a black box penetration test in any way? Show of hands. Nobody. Okay. All right, so I'll take a step back then and I'll fly through this. But a black box test or a white box vulnerability assessment, they all stem from the concept of, I'm building a system. I want to know what it's going to take for an outsider to attack it. So I'm going to engage a third party to come and help me understand what I'm exposed, what are my exposure points. And it's important that it's a third party because these third parties are not influenced by internal politics, deadlines, etc. The CEO can't just say, the CEO can say to his own internal team, stop that project, don't investigate that anymore. But if he's saying that to his vendor, the vendor says, okay, well, you paid me, do you want the deliverable? So a key distinction, I have a white paper on this that goes into much more detail. I'd be happy to email to anybody who wants it. But one of the key distinctions boils down to some high-level concepts, which I'll just introduce briefly. So the first, there's two sides. There's the methodology, and then there's the evaluation type. The methodology splits into two types, and it's black box or it's white box. And those boil down to access level. In a black box test, the investigating entity has no inside knowledge. The only knowledge they have is publicly available information, or they access a system and they try varying inputs and see what the output is and progress the attack accordingly. On a white box test, the investigating entity has full knowledge. They have access to design documents, engineers, source code if applicable, so on and so forth. On the evaluation side, you've got two types. A penetration test boils down to the objective of a very binary outcome. Can I or can I not breach the defenses? A vulnerability assessment, by contrast, the objective is to identify all vulnerabilities that exist in a system and to mitigate them accordingly. So, by show of hands, who here is a fan of Game of Thrones? I'm a big fan. The rest of you don't watch TV? It's only the best show on TV. It's also, yeah. I won't give any spoilers away. But so, for the rest of you who aren't familiar with this show, at least, my wife loves it too. For those of you who aren't familiar with the show, at least you're familiar with a castle. And so, to give a real-world physical example of what a black box test is, it would be like the king of the castle saying, I want to understand my resilience against being attacked by an outside force. So I send off my carrier pigeon to my cousin a few kingdoms away and say, send me your best knights, see if they can break in and tell me, where I stand. And so the knights, they come and they try to break in and they say, hey king, you're secure. Because what we found was you have a drawbridge and there's alligators in the moat and there's archers in the turrets and there's the guys with the hot oil that spill the oil down the side. You're secure. And so the king goes to bed that night very confident. He even says to his personal guard, who usually guards his door while he's asleep, he says, you don't even have to stay here tonight. Go home to your family. We're secure. We got this great security evaluation, so I'll be fine. Well, the king wakes up in the morning with his head cut off. And everyone says, how did this happen? How did our enemies get in here and kill the king when we just had this security evaluation that said we're secure? Well, in this example, there was a secret egress point through the sewers for the king in the event of a siege that he could get out to a field nearby and run away. Well, the attackers, the knights from the other kingdom, didn't know to look there. And so the fact that they didn't look there, does that mean that vulnerability did not exist? No. So that's one of the fundamental flaws with a black box approach, is that you found something, that you found an issue, does not mean you found everything. If you do not find something, does not mean that something does not exist. So the corollary approach, which would have saved the king's beautiful head, would be to look at things from a white box perspective. So what the king would have done in this case is he would have said, okay, I'm going to get together my architect, my engineers, my own king's guard, and I'll still bring in the knights from the other kingdom, and we're going to look at the plans, and we're going to say, where are we vulnerable? And they're going to pore over the plans, and they're going to say, well, you've got a moat, you've got alligators in the moat, you've got archers in the turrets, you've got the hot oil guys on the walls, but wait a minute, you've got this secret egress point. That could be repurposed as an ingress point. Now the king is empowered to make a decision. He can choose to not secure that access point. Maybe he doesn't want anybody in his king's guard to know about it. But he at least knows where the blind spots are in his calculation, and he can make the right decision. So going back to the chipset manufacturer, we arrived at a compromise with this particular customer who basically was insistent on doing a black box test, and we were insistent on doing a white box test. And so we said, well, let's do some of each. And what came out of it was some really interesting metrics that prove the point I just made. So what we did is we split it into two sessions, starting with black box and then moving into white box. And in each session, we spent about 2 months and 200 man-hours. In the black box session, we found 4 unconfirmed vulnerabilities. Of those vulnerabilities, 2 of them the customer already knew about. So we'd spent all this time researching these issues that didn't help the customer in any way because they already knew about these things. They didn't tell us that, hence the point of black box. The third issue was actually a non-issue. It was a misunderstanding on our part of how the system works. Again, we had no inside knowledge. And the fourth issue was, in fact, a confirmed vulnerability. So the outcome of the effort was 200 man-hours to discover 1 confirmed vulnerability, of which we were unable to provide any mitigation recommendation. It was on the customer to try to figure out how to fix it. And the reason we couldn't provide that was because, again, we didn't know how the system was architected. Then we moved into the white box session. Again, 2 months, 200 man-hours, equal distribution of resources. Within the first week, we had identified 7 critical issues. Throughout the rest of the evaluation, our customer had asked us to come on site, embed with their team, and we embedded with their team, had a higher level of access, and were able to discover even more issues. And by the end, we had discovered and confirmed 21 issues. This is the same chipset. We had only found 1 doing it at black box. We then were able to identify at least 1 mitigation strategy for each vulnerability. Some of them had multiple strategies. And so when you look at it from a per issue cost, it was 200 man-hours to identify one issue with no mitigation in black box. It was about 9 hours per issue to identify all of those 21 issues and provide mitigation strategies using the white box. So the next attack we'll talk about is small office, home office routers. So this is where the talk gets a little scary. Because what our research found, we started a study April of last year. And one of our analysts came to me and he said, Ted, I've been messing around with my router at home. I think there's some issues with it. Should we research this? And we said, sure, let's take a look at it. And so what we wound up deciding to do was go look at the 10 most popular small office, home office routers. These are the routers you buy at Best Buy or on Amazon or wherever that make all the lists of the top recommended routers. These are the routers you definitely have in your house, in your home office. And there's absolutely the routers that I have in my home as well. And so what we did was we said, let's go get the 10 most popular ones, and we'll take a look at those. And our hope was if we can find issues with 3 or 4 of them, this will be a pretty significant success. What wound up happening was we expanded the scope of the review to 13 throughout the course of the review because it was going so well, and we broke every single one. Every single of the most popular routers is vulnerable to either a remote attack, a local attack, or both. So this is how the attacks work. This is a remote attack. So this clever guy on the right is around the world somewhere, let's say Romania, and he's attacking one of us in our home offices in San Diego. This is what a home office in San Diego looks like. And so he attacks us by simply getting us to browse to a malicious page. He does that either by, we just inadvertently go to that page, maybe through a bad search that we shouldn't have done, or we click it through a spear phishing campaign, or there's even, there was an example last year where Yahoo's homepage, the ads on that homepage were compromised. So if you click that ad, which you'd have no reason not to think you could click that ad, it sent you to a malicious site. So you, as the user, click the malicious site, and like that, the attacker owns all the traffic across your router. And so what that means is that everything you're trying to do that is internet-facing, whatever sites you're trying to go to, he controls where you actually go. So he can send you to other malicious sites. He can send you to sites that start automatic downloads, and there's a number of things that he can do. So that's a remote adversary. That's someone across the world who today could be attacking all of us. The local attack, at first glance, seems maybe less interesting because you need to be on the same local network to attack someone. But this is actually dramatically more serious because this requires no user interaction. I don't have to travel to a website. You don't have to make me click a link. All that an attacker has to do is walk into the, say, the coffee shop, stopped at Starbucks on my way here this morning, sat down. If I were to open up my laptop, which I, having studied this, would never do now, and I connect to that Wi-Fi, a router can attack me. And it works simple as this. The attacker comes into that coffee shop, which of course requires them to be present, but they come into the coffee shop, they look up using a simple tool what router is powering that Wi-Fi. They then cross-reference that with a list, such as the list that we have published or others have published, that talk about all the vulnerabilities in that particular router. They cross-reference it, figure out which attack works, and then run the automated scripts. Now they own that router. Everyone in that coffee shop gets redirected to their malicious site, and the attack continues like that. Before we publish this list, or before we publish really any of our research, we always go through a process known as responsible disclosure, where we coordinate with the vendors or the manufacturers, and we say, here are the issues we found, here's how to fix it, here's the period of time until we go to press, so please fix it. We don't want to give away attack details. Unfortunately, the router manufacturers have not answered the call. They have not risen to the challenge, and these devices are still vulnerable today. The worst case scenario with the remote attack was that someone could create a self-propagating worm that just moves from one router to the next around the world. And that was part of our responsible disclosure to these vendors, to these manufacturers. We said, this is a significant issue. This is the worst case scenario. Fast forward from April until January of this year, and it happened. In the UK, it is now out in the wild. There is a worm that is, in fact, doing this. So what are the lessons we can take away from this? What are the lessons the router manufacturer should take, and what should we all take? And so the first is that we should separate security and functionality. One thing that's interesting when you look at the market of these small office, home office routers, how they choose to differentiate is on feature set. Fundamentally, a router only needs to route traffic. But now they have things like network attached storage and many other features that are basically ancillary. And there are issues with focusing on functionality and marginalizing security. And oftentimes it comes down to corporate structure. So many companies look like this very oversimplified structure, which is that functionality and security roll up into the same group, generally IT, which then rolls up to the C-suite management. The way things should run is functionality should roll into IT and security should run into security. And the reason for that is for conflict. So conflict is a very good thing when it is between teams, not within a team. An example to sort of characterize that is the conflict that happens between chief marketing officer and chief financial officer. If the chief marketing officer did not have a CFO, he might say, I'm going to go to this trade show. It looks really nice. There's probably customers there. I'm going to spend $100,000 on this one. And writes himself his check, and off he goes. Well, the role of the CFO is to challenge that CMO and say, prove to me why this is worth $100,000. And what that does is that facilitates dialogue. Now, the outcome of that dialogue might be $100,000 is the right spend. It might even be we should spend more than $100,000. This is all of our customers. Or it might be we should spend less than this. But the point is, whatever the outcome is the best outcome for the company and for that company's customers. And so moving back to functionality and security, one of the things we want to look at is that these have different priorities. The function group cares about things like user experience, delivery timelines, things like that. The security group cares about things like access control and defense in depth. And those do not marry, so what happens is if they're in the same group, there has to be a ranking of those priorities, and oftentimes security becomes the last priority to move a product out the door. But when there's conflict between the teams, they might arrive at a decision that says, well, this is the best compromise of functionality and security to get this out the door on deadline. So the next attack, who here uses Snapchat? I see some people pointing at each other, so I guess you're all identifying that this is in fact a product aimed at tweens. So I guess if you use Snapchat, you probably also love Twilight. So what Snapchat is, for those of you who don't know, is Snapchat is a messaging app that basically allows you to send videos or pictures to a fellow Snapchat user that, in theory, deletes as soon as some predetermined amount of time occurs. And one of the things that I don't want to focus so much on that particular aspect, whether or not the things are deleted, because that has been, there's been a lot of research around that, and quite frankly, that who really cares? But what is interesting about Snapchat is the way that someone can verify phone numbers and other identifying information that can then be used in other attacks. And so earlier this year, Snapchat was actually attacked, and I thought that was a great version of their logo for this story. So in December, just before New Year's of last year, Snapchat came out with a new feature called Add a Friend. And the concept of Add a Friend was, I'm a Snapchat user, I want to know who my friends are that also use Snapchat so I can send them whatever types of pictures I might want to that can be automatically deleted. And so Snapchat quickly rolled this out, and they left themselves exposed. And so the way that it's supposed to work is that you allow Snapchat to access your contacts, you upload your entire contact book, and Snapchat cross-references the phone numbers in your contacts with the Snapchatters that it has in its database, and it spits back to you, these are your friends who have Snapchat, and there's an easy button to add them. Well, Snapchat implemented it improperly, and what an attacker could do is an attacker could upload a database of, say, all the phone numbers within an area code. Let's say all the numbers in 858, the number here in San Diego, or one of the numbers. They upload that entire database, and Snapchat spits back all users that match those numbers, even if that isn't a friend of this particular attacker. And so what it does for the attacker is it delivers the attacker a few things. It verifies a phone number with a name, and it gives the attacker the username of this person. And so there's a couple important points to that. One, many people use the same username across the internet, various different accounts. And so now the attacker has information that they can use to attack other services now that they know their name, their phone number, and their actual full name. And quite frankly, an attacker could just be annoying. They could just call you, they know your name, they know your phone number, and if they want to market to you or be a just annoying teenager, they could do that too. So to describe what the issue was there, who's ever had the problem where you're trying to log on to one of your accounts, 4 or 5 tries later, it locks you out and says, you've tried too many attempts, follow back in an hour. So who's that happened to? Okay, that's happened to everybody. It happened to me this morning, so you're in good company. That's a function known as rate limiting. And so what rate limiting does is it basically says that if someone actually knows this information, within a certain amount of tries, they should be able to guess it. And that number is relatively small. It's typically less than 10, and as we've all evidenced, sometimes that's not enough, but that's our own fault. Too many passwords. But without rate limiting, it allows an attacker to just try every single possibility that exists. And that's why rate limiting exists. Snapchat introduced this feature without rate limiting because they were interested in getting this product out to their customers. So what do we learn from this? What's the key takeaway? There is a difference in security methodologies, and these next 2 paradigm shifts that I'm going to talk about both relate to how you can build better security that is less expensive. Lower investments of resources, lower investments of cost to create a more hardened solution. And the first is building it in versus bolting it on. The concept with building it in is having security part of the development process all throughout. And bolting it on is build the product, and when you're ready to go to market, then have someone take a glance at security. Similar to any issues with development bugs, who here is in software development? Okay, not many. Well, then I will explain this. So the concept of this graph, which is familiar to any software developers, is that a design bug or requirements bug, which happens early in the phase of development, that's found after deployment or in maintenance, is astronomically more expensive to fix than if that same bug is identified when it's first introduced. It's the same with security. A security flaw that's found when after you're deployed that's a design level issue is, to some companies, impossible to fix. So as we look at a typical waterfall development methodology, and we can do a similar thing for Agile or any other development methodology, but as you go through the various stages of developing a system, people say, well, we have to be laser focused on what we're doing in this stage. There's not time for security, and I counter that with, you already have all the right conversations in place. You just need to ask a couple extra questions. So for instance, in the requirements phase, the point is, let's determine the needs of the business and the users for why we're building this system. Well, in that same conversation, start talking about a threat model. What are the assets? Who are the adversaries? How does it impact this particular system? So that then when you get into design, everything you're doing relates back to that threat model, and it continues accordingly. So what we did is we've aggregated all of our data from all of our reviews over the past 9 years to look at if we're asking our customers to change the way that they look at security, what are we asking them to do from a financial perspective? And what we found was it's less expensive. This is what we thought, but we needed the data to back it up. And so there's 2 aspects to the cost. One is the actual material financial cost. And so compared to just focusing on security at the very end, having some sort of entity do some sort of security review when you're about to deploy a system, versus having that same security eyes on every stage of the process, it's about 10% less expensive. However, the real cost savings comes in mitigation. So for every issue that's found in the appropriate stage, let's say it takes that 1 hour to fix that issue, those same issues when they get later in the stage, so again, using a requirements bug that's found in maintenance or after deployment, we found that with applications, it typically takes about 25 times the resources to fix it. And in the case of an infrastructure, it takes about 300 times that resource investment. So it's actually less expensive to focus on security as you're going. I started this talk mentioning that we were the first company to hack the iPhone. And so I want to talk about that attack a little bit because I'm an Apple fanboy, and I just really like Apple products. So who in here is also an Apple fanboy? We got some fangirls. Okay, sorry. Who's a fan person? I like that. I was asking my wife last night, how many Apple products do we have? And the count is 10. It's a little ridiculous. So I'm not here to sell Apple. I'm here to talk about how we broke Apple. But when we rewind in our minds back to when the iPhone was first introduced, remember how hot that was? I mean, probably one of the hottest consumer electronics products that has come out in decades. Game changer, created a whole new industry, and improved a lot of lives. Now, not to say that's what they started has now been very effectively replicated by others. So that's no longer common about iPhone. But when we're looking at that moment in time, this changed everything. And so from a security perspective, we wanted to research, well, what issues does this introduce? And quite honestly, we wanted to see, if people are going to be talking about iPhones, would they be talking about ISE if we can break the iPhone? So we wanted to be first. That was really important to us. So what we did was we wanted to look at the browsing functionality, because that's one of the core changes that the iPhone brought to daily life, is the ability to, in my pocket, I have access to an immense amount of information. I can browse the internet, and it's a beautiful experience. And so what we did was we took a look at what vulnerabilities are known already out in the world regarding the Safari browser. We had made the guesstimate that the Safari desktop browser, some version of it would be ported to a mobile version for the iPhone at its release. And so we wanted to say, well, maybe we can take advantage of that. And sure enough, we found that there was a vulnerability that had been disclosed about a few weeks before the iPhone was released in the desktop version of Safari. And we wanted to look at, does that same thing apply in the iPhone, the mobile version? And in fact, it did. So what we were able to do was we were able to write a buffer overflow attack on a site that if the user were to browse to that site, we now obtain administrative control over the phone. We can do everything that you can do holding the phone. We could send and receive emails. We could send and receive text messages. We could modify contacts, modify pictures, everything. And we proved this concept actually with we had a reporter from the New York Times embedded in the study, and we proved it while this reporter was sitting at his desk in New York, and we were in our headquarters in Baltimore, we took over his phone. He was, of course, complicit in this, and we didn't do any damage, but that's how we proved that it worked. So what is the key lesson here? So security as an ongoing process is an important takeaway here. So similar to building security in rather than bolting it on at the end, once a system's deployed, we need to think about security in an ongoing basis, about how to maintain security over time. And again, this is an approach that will deliver a more hardened solution that is less expensive from a security standpoint. So what this graph represents is feature creep. So over time, a system will continue to iterate and develop. You'll keep adding features, and as you're adding features, features are effectively attack surfaces. It's not a direct one-to-one ratio, but features basically introduce the possibility for attack. So this is what a typical long period review cycle looks like, where people will overlay security at typically an annual basis, where they'll come back, they'll say, oh, we're going to run some other type of review. We're going to have a third party come in and see how it's changed as we've been developing. So there's still some exposure. Looking at it at a quarterly basis means that as you iterate the system, it does not, in fact, become grossly more insecure. Now, of course, there's potential issues, but they're largely reduced. And so again, going back to the question, well, okay, Ted, you've just suggested going from 1 review a year to 4. What are the financial ramifications of that? And the financial ramifications are it's actually less expensive to do 4 of these at a quarterly interval than 1 of these at an annual interval. And the reason is things like your learning curve are eliminated. It would be like if you took your developers off of a project for a year, brought them back and said, okay, you need to be at the exact same proficiency you were a year ago. They'd have some learning to do. They'd have to see where the system was. They'd have to get reacclimated with everything. And it's the same with security. Plus, with the limited downtime, you're able to provide a level of guidance to a system that otherwise would be very challenging to obtain. So for instance, you could call up your security team and say, hey, we're thinking about making this particular tweak. What are the ramifications? And on the phone, you can get some guidance. Or maybe they have to think about it and call you back. But it's not, okay, well, to give you that guidance, we need to come to your office. We need to sit down for a few hours. We need to see where everything sits. I already know all of that. Who's familiar with Heartbleed? Good. Wow, okay, a lot of hands. I was worried that I was not going to see many hands to that. So apparently you guys read the news, so that's good. This will be the last attack that we'll cover today, and this will relate also back to the security as an ongoing process. But so Heartbleed, obviously you're all familiar with it. It affects pretty much the entire internet. More specifically, it affects 2/3 of the internet, but that probably means that everyone who uses the internet at some point probably crosses one of those services. The way the Heartbleed works is it's based on a function known as a heartbeat. And what the heartbeat basically is at its most simple form, and I'm really oversimplifying this here, but it basically has a system communicate with a server, and the system says to the server, server, are you there? If so, send me back some information within these parameters. So it would be along the lines of pinging the server and saying, server, are you there? If so, give me back cat. Cat is 3 letters. And server says, I'm here, here's cat. And then you say, server, give me back house, 5 letters. And the server says, I'm here, house. The attacker will say, server, are you there? Give me dog, 500 letters. And the server will say, dog, and then 497 more letters. And so basically what this means, what data this is pulling from, is all of the traffic across that server is subject to this attack vector. So what kind of data is that? The kind of data at the lowest level is information about the system that an attacker can use to leverage for other attacks. Moving up the priority chain, it's things like usernames and passwords. These are my usernames and passwords. These are your usernames and passwords. And these are the credentialed access of the vendors of those systems that you're accessing. But it also is the holy grail for an attacker. It's the encryption keys themselves can be obtained. And if you get the encryption keys, any encrypted data is now subject to decryption regardless of the resiliency of that encryption. And so an attacker can not only decrypt your data, they can also pose as a legitimate site in a way that is indistinguishable because they can replicate the certificate authority. And they can replicate your certificate. So what should we be doing both at a provider level and at a user level? Well, providers, you need to, if you use OpenSSL, which is where this stems from, you need to, if you haven't done it already, leave right now, do not listen to the rest of this talk, and go update to OpenSSL, the newest version. But open to the patch version, it solves this issue. Once you've done that, you want to revoke and issue new certificates. So that's a key distinction that is being lost in the conversation. That just updating to the new patch actually doesn't solve it if the attacker has already obtained the encryption keys. So we need new certificates, and then once there's new certificates in place, change your access credentials. And at the user level, what you want to do, and we should all be doing this if you haven't done this, when you go home today, definitely do this. Go figure out which services that you access are vulnerable. Think about this. This is relating to things that involve encryption. So this is probably things that involve your money. So go home and you want to type into it. I have our tool here. There's plenty of other tools as well around the internet. Basically, it's simple. You just type in what service you're concerned about, and it will tell you whether or not that service is or was vulnerable and whether it's patched. Don't do anything until a service has been patched. Once a service has been patched, then go access it and change your credentials. If you change your credentials before it's been patched, you're just giving the credentials to the bad guy again. And of course, if the service wasn't vulnerable, then you have nothing to worry about. But hopefully by now, it was the beginning of last week, so hopefully by now, most services are up to date, although to my dismay, I got an email yesterday from one of my financial service providers a week and a half later that it took them that long to fix it. But we should be getting in the clear with providers by now, I think. So just going back 1 second. So how do we relate this back to the security as an ongoing process? Well, this issue stemmed out of a bug that arose in OpenSSL a little over 2.5 years ago. And so one of the challenges is as people are choosing to integrate something like OpenSSL or any other third-party system, to think about what the impact that system is going to have on your own system. That someone else says it's secure or that someone else thinks it's secure is irrelevant. You need to be, as you're iterating and you're developing and you're building things into your system, thinking about what those ramifications are. So to wrap up here with some key takeaways, along those same lines of things you should be thinking about when you're looking at other parties. Questions that you should be asking if you are looking to integrate some sort of third party into your application or into your environment. These are questions you should be asking of that vendor. And if you're a vendor, you should really be asking of yourself to be able to come to your customer with this information. And so the first is you should be talking about assets. So if you're interviewing a vendor about this, you should be asking them, which of my assets are you taking into consideration? How does it play into your threat model? What adversaries are also built into that threat model, et cetera. Then you want to talk about design principles. As we're building it, what secure design principles were you taking into account? Did you build in defense in depth? Did you implement least privilege? Things like that. And then you want to ask about attack surfaces. I mentioned before that features are typically related to attack surfaces. As a vendor, you should be able to articulate, well, I'm selling you these features, these introduce these attack vectors, and there's nothing wrong with that, saying that, but this is what we've been doing to mitigate the exposure. And then along those lines, you want to be inquiring of your vendors about what sort of testing did you do during development. And this is an area that people need to really sharpen the lens and take a close look at what the answers are. Because a lot of times the answer will be, we do security. We did a review. Well, what the answer needs to be is, well, what methodology did you use? Was it black box or white box like we talked about before? Was it a manual investigation or was it automated? Was it just a penetration test or was it something more? Because those allow a purchasing entity to understand their exposure. And then once a system's deployed, what sort of things are you doing on an ongoing basis in order to ensure that it's hardened over time? So that pretty much sums it up for me. We covered several paradigm shifts. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has, or I'll be here all day and we can talk then. So if any questions.